The biggest mistake of Josie Mercer's life was giving a bath to a dog, a 150-pound Neapolitan Mastiff that had thrown three grown men to the ground, a dog that even armed bodyguards kept their distance from whenever it ate. 3 months later, the most ruthless man in Chicago, a man who could make people tremble just by setting a coffee cup down on a table, was still quietly finding every excuse to keep that poor housemaid inside his estate. And Josie, on that autumn morning when she carried her bucket of water through those towering black iron gates, had no idea that the floors she was about to scrub on her belonged to a territory where even the police knocked before entering, or that the quiet man she was about to order around like a handyman was a name no one in the city dared to look in the eye. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe so you never miss the stories still waiting to be told. The number 49 bus dropped Josie Mercer at the head of the street at 6:45, and she still had to walk nearly a kilometer before she reached the black iron gate, taller than two people standing one on top of the other. The service company had given her only an address, an appointment time, and one brief, strangely hard to understand warning. Don't ask too many questions. For someone carrying unpaid hospital debt and 3 months of rent coming due, Josie wasn't in the habit of asking too many questions. She only needed the work. The man waiting just inside the gate wore a gray coat, his face as dry as an official report. He introduced himself as Gideon Ashby and didn't offer his hand. He looked her over from head to toe exactly once, not in an indecent way, but in the way of someone comparing a living person against a file he had already memorized. Then he said, in a voice as even as if he were reading figures aloud, that her background was clean, so clean he'd had it checked a second time. Josie didn't know how to answer a compliment that sounded like a warning, so she only nodded and shifted the strap of her cloth bag higher on her shoulder. Beyond the gate, the mansion appeared behind a row of maples, shedding their autumn leaves. So large she had to lift her eyes twice before she could take in the whole roof. Josie had cleaned plenty of rich people's houses on the north side of the city, but none had ever given her this feeling, the sense that the entire garden was holding its silence under some unspoken command. The housekeeper who received her at the side door was a silver-haired woman with her hair pinned neatly in a bun, almost 60 years old, named Pearl Hutchins, with a ring of keys in her hand that weighed like a cluster of iron fruit. She led Josie along the service corridor, pointing out the laundry room, the storage room, the way out to the backyard, her voice crisp with the authority of someone who had given instructions to dozens of maids before. But near the end of the tour, she stopped, turned fully around, and for the first time looked straight into Josie's eyes. "There's only one rule in this house that you absolutely mustn't forget," she said. "The dog in the backyard. Don't go near it. Don't feed it. Don't try to pet it. The 3 people before you didn't listen, and all 3 of them no longer work here." Josie opened her mouth to ask, but Mrs. Pearl had already turned away, the ring of keys clinking, as though it placed a final period at the end of the story. Her first morning passed in the smell of floor cleaner and the scrape of a brush. Josie worked in the service wing, exactly as the contract required, kneeling to scrub each tile in the hallway that led out to the backyard until both her knees went numb. Near noon, Mrs. Pearl told her to carry soapy water outside and wash the stone steps behind the house. Josie carried the old tin bucket with her, the only thing in this glittering mansion that felt familiar, because it looked exactly like the bucket her mother used to use. The stone steps were still damp with dew. Josie stepped down onto the 3rd step when the worn sole of her canvas shoe slipped. She flailed, her hand grasping at empty air, and in the split second when she tried to keep her balance, the bucket flew from her hand and traced an arc through the air. The entire bucket of soapy water came pouring down over a massive black shape lying in the sun 3 steps away. The whole backyard went dead still. The 2 guards posted at the corner of the garden both moved their hands toward their hips, then froze as if neither of them dared breathe too loudly. Josie sat hard on the stone step, her hair falling loose, and for the first time she clearly saw the thing she had just drenched. It was the largest dog she ever seen in her life, a Neapolitan Mastiff, with folds of skin stacked across its face like a statue shaped and reshaped by time, its shoulders as broad as a door. The dog Mrs. Pearl had warned her about, the dog for which the 3 people before her had paid the price. Soapy water streamed from the top of its head. One of the two guards began backing step by step toward the door. But Josie didn't back away. Because she was seeing something no one else in that yard was seeing. That enormous animal wasn't growling. It wasn't baring its teeth. It wasn't lunging. It was trembling. All 70 kilograms of its body pressed close against the wall. 4 paws braced against the ground, both ears flattened backward, and its amber eyes stared wide at the puddle, spreading across the stone as if it were looking at something that had once hurt it. Josie had seen that look once before, in the training clinic during her second year of college, in the eyes of a stray dog someone had brought in, the look of fear that had grown old. She forgot Mrs. Pearl's warning. She forgot the two guards holding their breath behind her. Josie slowly took off her shoes so she wouldn't slip again, then lowered herself all the way down onto the wet stone, making herself small until her eyes were level with the dog's, both palms resting open on her knees so it could see them clearly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice slow and steady, as if she were speaking to a person. "I didn't mean to. The water scares you, doesn't it? I know. I'll sit right here. I won't come any closer. You just look at me as long as you need to first." The dog was still trembling, but its flattened ears began to lift a little. At the corner of the yard, the younger guard whispered to his partner that he should probably call up to the main house, and at a second-floor window, a curtain had just stirred slightly, though no one below noticed in time. 10 minutes passed without anyone in the backyard daring to move, until Josie realized one very practical thing, that the soapy water was slowly drying on the dog's black coat, and dried soap would make its skin itch and burn for the entire week. She couldn't just leave it like that. The problem was that this animal would clearly rather suffer the itching than let anyone bring water near it one more time. Josie sat still for another while, watching the way it braced all 4 paws against the ground, the way its amber eyes never left the spreading puddle. Then she made a decision that nearly made the 2 guards at the corner of the garden forget how to breathe. She rose very slowly, went to turn on the faucet along the side of the house, filled a low tin basin with water, then dragged it out into the middle of the yard, exactly 5 steps away from the dog, and sat down beside the basin as if it were the most natural seat in the world. "I'm just sitting here," she said. "You don't have to do anything." Then, before the Mastiff's wide eyes, Josie rolled up her sleeves, dipped both her hands into the basin, stirred the water gently so it could hear the sound, then scooped up a ladleful and poured it straight over her own bare arm. "See," she went on, her voice steady and casual, as if she were telling some idle story. "It doesn't hurt at all. Water doesn't bite. Water is only wet." The dog didn't move, but its ears had lifted fully now. Josie scooped up a second ladleful, this time pouring it over her pant leg, then a third over her bare foot, all while talking about every wandering thing that came into her mind, about the bus being late that morning, about her landlady keeping a parrot that only knew how to curse, about how, when she was little, she'd once been afraid of water too after slipping at a swimming pool, and her mother had to sit beside the edge of the pool for 3 afternoons just so she'd dare to dip one toe in. She kept talking and scooping water and pouring it over herself, not once looking directly into the dog's eyes, not once moving any closer to it, until her sleeves were soaked through, and the 2 guards began exchanging looks that said this girl was perhaps not entirely normal. Then the thing no one was waiting for happened. The Mastiff lifted one front paw off the ground. It stood there for 3 seconds, trembling, as if arguing with its own memories, then set the paw down and took 1 step toward the basin. Josie didn't turn her head. She only scooped up another ladleful, poured it over her shoulder, and continued the unfinished story about the parrot. The dog took another step, then another. 70 kilograms of fear moved slowly, like a mountain learning how to walk, until its enormous wet nose stopped a handspan from the rim of the basin. It lowered its head and sniffed the surface of the water for a very long time. Josie scooped up a small ladleful, held it out before its nose so it could smell the ladle, then poured the water very slowly onto the stone right beside its paw, so only a few drops splashed onto its claws. The dog startled and backed away half a step, looked down at the droplets on its foot, then looked at her. "It doesn't hurt, does it?" Josie whispered, and then, exactly 1 hour after the fateful bucket had flown from her hand, the dog that once knocked down 3 grown men lifted its own front paw and placed it inside the basin of water. Just 1 paw. But at the corner of the garden, the younger guard let out a muttered curse and was elbowed in the ribs by his partner. Josie worked slowly from that moment on, every motion announced first with words. Now I'm going to rub water over your leg, all right? Now I'm going to scratch the spot on your shoulder. The soap has dried here, so I have to rinse it carefully. She didn't use the hose, only the ladle and her 2 hands, rubbing each handful of foam from the folds of skin stacked along its neck. And at some point, the dog closed its eyes, its head as large as a stone resting fully against her shoulder, so heavy that she had to brace one hand against the ground, soaked through, and laugh. Her laughter rang across the backyard, clear and bright in the middle of the autumn noon. On the 2nd floor of the mansion, behind the window of his study, Rocco Marchetti had been standing motionless for 40 minutes. The cup of coffee in his hand had gone cold long ago, though he hadn't noticed. Down below was the dog he had brought home 3 years earlier, the animal that had knocked down 3 professional handlers, made 2 service companies return their deposits, and that even he, a man who could buy an entire veterinary hospital if he wished, had never managed to do more with than stand and watch as it avoided every running faucet like an old enemy. Yet now it was standing in the middle of the yard, drenched, eyes closed, its head resting on the shoulder of a thin, slight maid who hadn't even worked there one full morning, a girl who didn't know what the dog was, whose dog it was, or what it had done to make the entire mansion treat it with wary respect. Gideon had knocked and entered at some point, standing beside his employer and looking down into the yard. Then, in his usual dry voice, he said he requested permission to cancel the contract with the training company in Denver, because perhaps the household no longer needed it. Rocco didn't answer. He was watching the way that girl used an old towel to dry the dog's head, her calloused hands carefully slipping through each fold of skin, as if the thing before her weren't the most frightening animal on the north side of Chicago, but something terribly breakable. "Your coffee's gone cold, sir," Gideon reminded him. Rocco set the cup down on the windowsill and spoke his first sentence after 40 minutes of silence. "Keep her. Long-term contract." Gideon looked at his employer for one more second, asked nothing, turned, and left, and when the door closed behind him, the most ruthless man in Chicago still stood by the window, looking down at the yard where dog had just been brought partly back to life, without knowing that he himself was about to be brought back the same way. What no one in the backyard knew was that only 2 hours before that fateful bucket had flown from Josie's hand, that same cup of coffee had gone with Rocco Marchetti down to the mansion's underground garage, where a man named Eddie Falk was waiting for him between 2 rows of sleek black cars, with the face of someone who hadn't slept for 3 nights straight. Eddie was in charge of a shipment route at the port, and was 2 weeks late with his payment, and in the world that ran beneath the city, 2 weeks wasn't a number. It was a declaration. He stood pressed beside a concrete pillar, both hands twisting together, and when the sound of Rocco's footsteps rang steadily across the cement floor, Eddie began talking very fast, about the shipment being held at customs, about his cousin turning traitor, about how he only needed 10 more days, just 10 days, and he'd pull enough together. Rocco didn't interrupt. He walked past him, slowly set the steaming cup of coffee down on the hood of the nearest car, the sound of porcelain touching metal so small it almost didn't exist. And yet Eddie fell silent halfway through his sentence, as if someone had pulled his cord from the socket. Rocco looked at him and said exactly one sentence: "Friday, before dark." That was all. He didn't mention the money. He didn't mention the consequences. He didn't need to, because in 4 years of running the North Side, Rocco Marchetti had never had to say anything twice. Eddie nodded again and again, fumbling to pull his car keys from his pocket so he could retreat as quickly as possible, and the keys slipped from his trembling fingers and fell onto the cement floor. He bent to pick them up, and they slipped again. He picked them up once more, his hands shaking so badly that the cluster of metal dropped for the 3rd time, clattering through the silent garage, until at last he had to sink full to one knee and cup the keys in both hands, as if he were holding a bird about to fly away. Rocco had already picked up his coffee and started toward the elevator without looking back. 30 seconds, that was the total amount of time he spent in the garage, and when the elevator doors opened on the 2nd floor, the coffee in the cup was still warm. The fate of that cup of coffee, as we already know, was to go stone cold 40 minutes later on the windowsill of his study, and perhaps in the entire city of Chicago there was no comparison more precise than that, for the man Rocco Marchetti was, A man who could decide a person's fate in 30 seconds without even letting his coffee cool, yet stand rooted in place for nearly an hour, just to watch a maid wash his dog's head. That evening, after Gideon confirmed that the long-term contract with the service company had been signed that afternoon, Rocco called him to remain in the study for another 5 minutes and gave an order unlike anything Gideon had ever heard in all 8 years of service. From tomorrow onward, in front of the new girl, no one in this mansion was to call him by name. Not Marchetti, not boss, not sir, not any title that might reveal who he was. Gideon stood still for 2 seconds. His profession didn't allow him to question an order, but his eyebrows hadn't been trained quite that well, and they rose high enough that Rocco had to add, his voice unchanged, that she worked better when she didn't know. "Then, if she asks who you are," Gideon asked. Rocco looked out at the black window for a while, then answered that they should let her draw her own conclusion. And so began one of the strangest performances ever staged in Chicago's underworld, where 14 armed security guards, 3 gardeners, 2 cooks, and a housekeeper nearly 60 years old had to learn how to pass the most powerful man on the north side each morning and merely nod at him as if greeting a coworker. Mrs. Pearl was the only one who objected. She stood in the kitchen with her arms folded and told Gideon that she had served this house since the young master's father's time, and had never once had to pretend he was an ordinary man. Gideon only replied in his usual even voice that an order was an order, then added one detail that made the whole kitchen fall silent, that the new girl would only work in the service wing, the backyard, the laundry room, and the dog enclosure, not the main wing, not the study, in order to reduce awkward situations. The guards received the order in the way guards did, which meant asking nothing in front of their superiors and gossiping a great deal behind their backs. And the young guard who had witnessed the bucket incident summarized the entire situation in one philosophical sentence over a late-night meal. "If the boss says so, then we do it. If the boss says he's security, then he's security." As for Josie, she ended her first workday with both sleeves still damp. A long-term contract she didn't understand why she had gotten so quickly, and a small secret of her own, that she had broken the only rule in this house on her very first morning. And the monster in the backyard that her 3 predecessors had paid for turned out to know how to rest its head on a other person's shoulder when scratched in just the right place behind the ear. On the bus ride back to her rented room at the end of the day, she dozed off twice from exhaustion and never noticed that half a city away, in a mansion with a black iron gate, the man to whom Eddie Falk had to bring money this Friday before dark was standing before the kennel of a dog that smelled clean and sweet with soap, watching it sleep soundly for the first time in weeks, and wondering what else that girl could see that the entire mansion did not. On Monday morning of the following week, when Josie appeared at the side door with her familiar cloth bag, Mrs. Pearl greeted her with the eyes of someone who had just witnessed a rare natural phenomenon, because in 26 years of managing this mansion, she had never seen the main house personally keep on a servant, much less a maid who had broken the only rule of the house on her very first morning. She didn't say that aloud. She only handed Josie the set of keys to the service wing, told her that her work schedule included the backyard, the laundry room, and the dog enclosure, then added, in the voice of someone reading a document she hadn't written herself, that the rule about the dog had been lifted, for her alone. Josie accepted the keys, thanked her, and didn't ask anything more, because that afternoon she still had a dishwashing shift at a diner on the west side. And a person who worked 2 jobs a day learned how not to waste strength on questions that didn't earn money. The dog was waiting for her in the backyard, and from the second she opened the wooden door that led out to the stone steps, it decided, with all 70 kilograms of itself, that the proper distance between it and this girl was no more than 2 steps. She did laundry, and it lay across the laundry room doorway. She hung bed sheets, and it walked straight through the rows of white fabric like a small mountain passing through clouds. She swept leaves, and it carried a second broom over and laid it at her feet as if offering to join in. By the 3rd day, Josie was scratching behind its ear while studying that wrinkled face, half closed with pleasure, and she blurted out a conclusion that would forever change the reputation of the most frightening animal on the north side of Chicago. That if she looked closely, it resembled an overstuffed teddy bear more than any vicious dog, so from now on she would call it Teddy. The young guard named Danny Rourke, who was drinking coffee 10 steps away, heard the entire sentence and choked so hard he had to turn his face toward the wall, because the animal that had just been named Teddy had, according to internal records, once sent a trainer with 8 years of experience away from the mansion in a private ambulance. And according to street rumor, it was the reason half the Port District didn't dare say the name Marchetti after 8 o'clock at night. But street rumors couldn't pass through the black iron gate, and in this sun-filled autumn backyard, there was only a girl tying her hair back and an oversized teddy bear dragging her left slipper in circles around the maple tree. That same week, Josie began running into the quiet man in the back garden. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wore dark shirts that never wrinkled, usually appeared around mid-morning with a stack of papers or a silenced phone, and always sat on the stone bench beneath the big maple as though that were his guard post. Josie put the facts together in her own way. A strongly built man, eyes that observed everything, familiar with the guards, often present in important places, and she arrived at a conclusion so reasonable that no one had the heart to correct it, that he was surely the mansion's head of security. She treated him exactly the way she would treat a senior but unusually idle coworker, which meant politely, directly, and with absolutely no unnecessary deference. On the 5th day, she asked him to hold the last ladder steady while she removed a kite caught in the gutter. And that man stood there holding the ladder for 15 minutes, serious as if he were guarding a safe, while in the corner of the yard, Danny Rourke and another colleague pretended to trim a bush that had already been trimmed the day before. On the 6th day, she asked him to carry a rosemary pot from the greenhouse desk because it was too heavy for her hands, and he carried it, with both hands, carefully placed it exactly where she pointed, then even turned it half a circle when she said the sunlight was coming from the wrong direction. But the event that made the mansion's entire security system have to cling to one another just to stay standing happened at noon on Saturday, when Josie came out of the laundry room just in time to catch the quiet man, breaking off half a slice of sausage from his lunch plate and dropping it down for Teddy. She marched straight over, planted both hands on her hips, and scolded him in a speech full of scientific reasoning, saying that salted sausage was the worst possible thing to give a large breed dog, that its kidneys weren't an industrial filtration machine, that if it ruined its stomach, she'd be the one cleaning up after it and not him, and ended by pointing a finger at him, saying that if there was one more time, she would report him to his manager. A very long silence settled over the backyard. The most powerful man on the north side of Chicago looked at the finger pointing at his chest, looked at the dog chewing up the last of the evidence, then spoke the second apology he had given in 4 years, the first having been to his mother at his father's funeral. "There won't be a next time," he said. Josie nodded in satisfaction, turned, and went back inside, never seeing the scene behind her, where 2 guards were lowering their faces into the shrubbery, with both shoulders shaking in waves, while Gideon Ashby, who had just stepped out intending to present a folder of documents, silently turned on his heel and went back inside with the folder still untouched in his hand, and deciding that some of her reports could wait until the afternoon. That night at the staff dining table, Danny Rourke added a new clause to his philosophical statement from the week before, that if the boss says he's security, then the boss is security, and if she reports the boss to the boss's manager, then all any of us can do is pray for that imaginary manager. As for Josie, on the evening bus back to her rented room, she opened her cracked screen phone and checked the same 2 things she checked every day, the text reminding her of tomorrow's dishwashing shift and her account balance, then leaned her head against the window and fell asleep, not knowing that back at the mansion behind her, her head of security had just canceled an evening meeting so he could stand in the backyard for another 10 minutes, throwing a brand new rubber ball with the text attached for the dog, the first toy he had bought for it in 3 years, only because someone had said that afternoon that it needed exercise instead of snacks. It began on a Wednesday afternoon, when Josie sat on the stone steps brushing Teddy's fur after her shift, a new little habit that both of them had come to regard as the reward at the end of the day. And as always, she brushed him on melting stories, because this dog was the only living creature in her life that could listen to her from beginning to end, without interrupting, without giving advice, without looking at the clock. Today she told him about the landlady, who had just raised her room rent by $30, about the canvas shoes whose left side had split open and which she planned to patch one more time just to get through the winter. Then her voice lowered a little when she came to the last story, something so small that even she didn't understand why she mentioned it, that these past few days, at the bus stop near her rented room, there had been a gray car that kept parking across the street. She had seen it there in the morning when she left for work, and it was still there at night when she came home. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, and that morning, while she was standing there waiting for the bus, she had the very clear feeling that someone inside the car was watching her, that prickling sensation at the back of the neck that people can't explain but also can't forget. "I'm probably imagining," she concluded, scratching the dog's deeply folded chin. "What would there be to look at in someone like me? Even my debts would need a ghost to collect them." Teddy tilted his head and listened with his usual solemnity, then snatched the brush from her hand and ran off, forcing Josie to chase him halfway across the backyard, her laughter mixing with the sound of dry leaves. The story about the gray car slipped from her mind that very afternoon. It did not slip from the mind of the man sitting 15 steps away on the stone bench beneath the maple tree, reading documents. Rocco did not move throughout the entire story, his eyes still fixed on the page. Only his thumb, the one that had been turning the pages, had stopped at some point, and when Josie chased the dog out of earshot, he closed the folder, walked back into the house with steps that were not 1 second faster than usual. And that was the most frightening thing about this man. His anger never showed itself in speed. At 11 o'clock that night, Gideon Ashby knocked on the study door and placed a single sheet of paper on the walnut desk. On it were a license plate number, a name, and 3 addresses. The gray car was registered under the name of a rental company on the south side, Gideon said. That company rents an office in a building owned by another company, and that other company pays taxes under the name of casino manager, who has worked for Frank Delano for 11 years. The room was so quiet they could hear the second hand of the clock above the fireplace. Delano, that name needed no explanation in this room, the lord of the south side, the man who had tried 3 times to push into the port route over the past 4 years and had been forced back 3 times, an old patient shark that had never stopped circling. "The car has been parked there for 8 days, Gideon continued. 2 men rotate shifts. They only take 8 photographs and record her schedule. They haven't approached her." He set several hurriedly printed photographs on the desk, the gray car beneath the streetlight, the bus stop, and one blurred shot taken from a distance, where the small figure of a girl with a cloth bag stood waiting for the bus in the early morning mist. Rocco looked at that photograph longer than the others. "My recommendation is to have our people remove that car from the street tonight," Gideon said, along with a message clear enough to send back to the south side. "No," Rocco said. Gideon waited. "Let it stay there," Rocco said, his eyes still on the photograph. "It has been parked there for 8 days and hasn't done anything, which means it hasn't been ordered to do anything yet, which means Delano is waiting for something. And I want to know what he's waiting for. More than I want him to know, I've seen him." He pushed the photograph back toward Gideon. "Remove the car, and he'll switch to another method, a quieter one. Leave it there, and his eyes remain exactly where I know they are." Then he gave the second order, his voice still even, as if he were giving instructions from Ting's schedule. "Double the men along her route, from the mansion gate to the bus stop, from the bus stop to her rented room, and the afternoon shift at the diner on the west side too. Our people are not to let her see them, not even once. They are not to make her change her habits. They are not to frighten her." Gideon remembered it without needing a notebook, but at the end he still asked one question, not because of procedure, but because in 8 years of working for this man, he had never seen a precedent for it. "Do we need to tell her so she can protect herself?" Rocco was silent for a while, and when he answered, he did not answer that question, but another one buried far beneath it. "She works 2 jobs a day and still manages to laugh," he said. "How many people like that are even left in this city? I won't allow anyone to take away her sleep, not even with a warning." Gideon gathered the sheet of paper and the photographs, went out, and closed the door without a sound. And if anyone asked, he would never admit that in the dark hallway, the driest lieutenant on the north side had stopped for half a second because he realized something still on any purge he had ever witnessed. that his boss had just assigned a force large enough to protect a governor to follow a maid who worked 2 jobs a day. And somehow, the old shark on the south side sensed it that before even Gideon's own boss had. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, inside a 9-square-meter rented room, Josie was sitting under the light of a desk lamp, sewing the toe of her canvas shoe back together while an old radio played a country song. And outside the window, beneath the sickly yellow streetlight, the gray car remained parked in the same place, motionless and patient as a trap that had already been wounded. The car appeared on an early November noon, walking on 4 tiny legs through a gap in the mansion's eastern fence, a skinny calico cat with 1 torn ear and the bearing of someone who had lost every street fight there was to lose, but had never once accepted defeat. It sat in the corner of the garden and watched Josie eat lunch with direct yellow eyes, not begging, merely announcing its presence, and Josie, who had never been able to win against a pair of eyes like that, broke off half of her chicken sandwich and set it down on the grass. The cat finished eating, licked its paw, then left without a word of thanks, and the next noon it returned right on time like an employee who had already signed a contract. By the 3rd day, trouble officially began, because Teddy discovered it. The 70-kilogram Mastiff stood frozen at the corner of the yard when it saw that betrayal, his girl crouching in the middle of the garden, using the same soft, slow voice that had once been meant only for him to talk to a calico lump of fur no bigger than his calf. And over the next 3 days, the entire mansion witnessed a battle for territory conducted entirely by body weight. Josie sat down with the cat, and Teddy came over and lay between them, precisely placing all 70 kilograms of himself into the 40-centimeter gap between the 2 sides. Josie moved left, and he moved left. She set the cat's plate on a high stone ledge to settle the matter, and he stood up on his hind legs, a posture that, according to Danny Rourke, had never been recorded in the history of the mansion, to shove his massive muzzle right into the middle of his enemy's meal. The cat, for its part, treated that black mountain of fur with the absolute contempt of its species, calmly eating beneath the shadow of the giant head breathing indignation down the back of its neck. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" Josie asked the dog on the 4th day, both hands on her hips. "It's the size of one of your ears and it's hungry, while you ate a huge bowl this morning." Teddy responded by flopping down directly on top of the cat's dish, an action that even he seemed to know was not especially honorable, because he avoided looking into her eyes the entire time. What no one expected was that the battle had a second front, quieter, and happening at a much higher level. The man sitting on the stone bench beneath the maple began to notice that the maid's lunch break, which had once been the 30 minutes she usually spent on the steps near him with the dog, had now moved to the eastern corner of the garden, where the cat was, exactly 20 steps farther from him, and he noticed that it irritated him. The feeling was so unreasonable that it took him a full afternoon to classify it. It wasn't a security concern. The cat had been checked by Gideon according to procedure, and the report had concluded, in deadly serious language, that the subject was a cat. It wasn't annoyance over work discipline, because she had never returned to her shift even 1 minute late. Then what was it? This small restlessness like a grain of sand in his shoe, each time he heard her laughter drifting from the far corner of the garden, meant for another creature. On the 5th day, Rocco Marchetti, who had once negotiated alone with 3 families at the same time, without a change in his heartbeat, caught himself walking out into the garden at exactly 12:15, with a reason so clumsily invented it was almost pitiful, that he needed to inspect the irrigation system in the eastern corner, an area he hadn't inspected in 4 years, and where he also didn't know the irrigation valve was located. Gideon, who had been presenting the week's schedule beside him, watched his boss Boz stride toward the garden where the maid and the cat were, stop halfway because he had recognized the absurdity of his own behavior, return to the stone bench, then stand up 5 minutes later to inspect the irrigation valve a second time. And that lieutenant, with 8 years of experience, chose the only professional solution left for the situation, which was to lift his eyes and study the clouds above Chicago with intense concentration. But that noon ended in a way no one had predicted. The cat finished eating and left early. Teddy immediately reclaimed the position beside his mistress with undisguised triumph, and Josie, her hand stroking along the dog's spine, naturally drifted into another story, her voice no longer teasing. "You know, I used to study to become a doctor for animals like you, she said. A real veterinary school. I studied for 2 years and 3 months, ranked 4th in my class, and the professor even said I had hands suited for the work. Then my mother got sick, and that kind of sickness never waits for anyone to finish school. She plucked a blade of grass and turned it between 2 fingers. I sold my books first, then the microscope I'd won as a prize, and by the last semester, I understood that I could only choose one, either tuition or hospital bills, and there was only one mother. She let out a faint laugh, the kind with nothing happy in it. The funniest part was that my mother was angry with me right up until she became very weak, holding my hand and telling me over and over that I had to go back to school, and I kept saying yes, yes, just to let her rest easy. But how was I supposed to go back, when I couldn't even afford a pair of shoes without holes in them? Teddy pressed his head into her lap, and she scratched his ear, gazing distantly toward the fence, never knowing that on the stone bench beneath the maple, the man with the folder had not turned a single page in minutes, and was sitting still as a statue, hearing every word, remembering all of it with the frightening memory he had once reserved only for debts. 2 weeks after the bucket incident, Josie decided it was time for Teddy to have his second bath, partly because his black coat had begun to carry the smell of rotting leaves after all those afternoons rolling around in the garden, and partly because she wanted to know whether that noon had been an accidental miracle, or whether a door had truly opened. She dragged the tin basin into the middle of the yard during her lunch break, turned on the water, and before she could even turn around to get the bottle of dog shampoo, she heard a strange sound behind her. Teddy was standing in the basin, all 4 paws. 70 kilograms of him had voluntarily tucked themselves inside the tin basin, his tail wagging slowly. And when he saw her standing there staring, stunned, he bent down, grabbed the plastic ladle floating on the surface of the water, and shoved it toward her with one decisive nudge, water splashing everywhere, like an unmistakable command that said, "Hurry up, start already." Josie laughed so loudly that the calico cat looking on the fences ran off, and she rolled up her sleeves and stepped closer, no longer needing to pour water over her own hands, no longer needing to tell the story about the parrot. There was only the sound of water, the sound of laughter, and a giant dog closing his eyes in pure enjoyment, as if his fear had never existed in this world at all. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the footsteps. Only when a shadow fell across the rim of the basin did she look up and see the head of security standing right there in the yard, closer than he had ever stood before, the sleeves of his dark shirt already rolled up without her noticing when it had happened. "Does he need someone to hold the shoulder area?" he asked. Josie blinked, then handed him the ladle. And so that noon, for the first time since she had walked through the black iron gate, 2 people from opposite ends of the city knelt together beside a basin of water, 4 hands moving over one enormous black back, and spoke to each other longer than all their previous conversations combined. She asked how long he had worked there, and he said since he was young, an answer that was strangely truthful. She asked whether the job was dangerous, and he thought for a moment before saying, "The most dangerous part was the things you had to decide, not the things you had to face." And Josie nodded and said that sounded like her work too, because every day she had to decide between buying meat or paying the electric bill. A short, hoarse laugh escaped him, sounding like an old hinge no one had opened in years, and he himself seemed surprised by the sound. She told him about her dishwashing and shift on the west side. About the kind-hearted diner owner who sometimes slipped her a decent box of leftovers, and he listened in a way she had never known from anyone before. Not impatient, not waiting for his turn to speak, only listening, now and then asking about some small detail that proved he was truly hearing her. Teddy lay between them, soaked through and content, occasionally nudging the ladle toward whichever one of them was neglecting their duty. Then came the final rinse, and as Josie worked the foam out of the thick folds of skin around the dog's neck, her fingers stopped on a hard line of skin running beneath the fur, something the naked eye couldn't see, but hands that had spent 2 years and 3 months in veterinary school could not mistake. An old scar, very old, and not the only one. She was silent for a moment, then asked, her voice softer now, that since he had worked here so long, he probably knew what had happened to this dog to make it so terribly afraid of water because, on the first day, it had looked at that puddle as if it were looking at something that had hurt it very badly. and there was a scar under its neck right here. And this scar wasn't from an ordinary dogfight. The man's hand, which had been moving along the dog's back, slowed and then stopped completely. He came from a very bad place, the man said after a while, his voice lower, before he came here. Josie waited. That place, he continued, and she heard clearly how carefully each word was being weighed. That place taught him that water was a punishment. He stopped there. Jo lifted her eyes to look at him, meaning to ask more. Who, where, why? A dozen questions from an unfinished veterinary student lining up behind her tongue. But then she saw the man's face, and all of those questions dissolved. He was looking at the dog, and yet not looking at the dog, his gaze passing through him toward someplace very far away and very dark. His jaw clenched so tightly the tendons stood out, and in that moment Josie realized she was standing before a closed door, the kind of door a decent person did not knock on. She lowered her eyes, scooped up the last ladleful of water to rinse the final foam from the dog's leg, and said in the same voice she used with frightened animals, "Well, what matters is that now he knows water can also be an afternoon like this." The man turned to look at her for a very long time, as if that sentence had touched some place that existed on none of his security maps. Teddy chose exactly that moment to step out of the basin and shake himself, sending a rain of soapy water over both people sitting on either side of him. Josie cried out, then burst into laughter. The head of security raised a hand to wipe foam from his cheek, and at the kitchen window, Mrs. Pearl Hutchins stood looking down at that yard in silence, for a long while, one hand still holding the gel she had been using, not because the most dangerous dog on the north side had just finished the second bath of his life, but because on the face of the man she had served since he was a boy, standing with folded arms at his father's funeral, she had just seen again something she thought had been buried with the Marquette house a very long time ago. On a Saturday evening at the end of November, the Marquette mansion lit up the entire main house. 12 black cars passed one after another through the iron gate, and Mrs. Pearl mobilized the whole kitchen wing for a dinner that took place only twice each year, the dinner of the allied North Side families, where each 3-layer place setting on white linen represented a territory, a stream of money, and several thousand people whose lives depended on the men around that table still being willing to sit together. But Josie wasn't allowed anywhere near the main wing on occasions like this. She had only been told to stay later than usual, to help the laundry room handle the second round of tablecloths, and from the small window in the service wing, she watched the procession of black cars glide silently into the front courtyard, privately wondering what kind of business this house did, that it received guests as if it were welcoming heads of state. In the grand dining room, Pauke moved in its own way, without a single gun showing, only seating arrangements speaking of rank, nods heavy as signed documents, and the silence of the man seated at the head of the table, the man who poured wine for his guests with his own hands according to the old custom left by his father, yet had never raised his glass before anyone. One by one, the families presented the affairs of winter, the port routes, the warehouses by the river, the old shark on the south side circling closer to the border than usual these days. And Rocco listened to everything with the kind of silence that made each speaker automatically trim the embroidery from his own words after every sentence. Only one man in that dining room wasn't pressed down by that silence, a handsome silver-haired man past 55, broad-shouldered, loud laughing, arriving 5 minutes late and making up for it by pulling the host into an embrace right in the middle of the room, clapping him 3 times on the back with a sound everyone could hear, calling out that his nephew had gotten thin, and asking what kind of eating he had been doing. That was Sal Bianchi, owner of the Northwest Transport Line, childhood friend of the late Marchetti boss, the only living person who had once held Rocco when the boy was 3, the only person in this world permitted to call the man at the head of the table his nephew, and also the only one who had sat up all night with the 26-year-old young man after the funeral, pouring him the first glass of wine of his life as a boss, and telling him to cry, because only his uncle was there, and tomorrow, out there, he would have to become stone. The whole banquet visibly softened once Sal took his seat. The old man told stories about losing at cards to his wife, about his granddaughter forcing him to quit cigars, and his laughter drew iron faces closer together more effectively than any treaty. Even Gideon, standing watch in the corner of the room, had to admit in his mind that this alliance had managed to keep breathing through more than a dozen winters, half because of the silence of the man at the head of the table, and half because of this old man's laughter. The main course had just been served when disaster arrived. In the service wing, Josie was gathering a pile of cleaning rags for the final wash, but Teddy, who had been shut inside the fenced kennel area since dusk, according to procedure on guest nights, discovered that some hurried hand had not fastened the gate latch completely that evening, and the 70-kilogram Mastiff with the sharpest nose in the mansion decided he missed his girl. He followed her scent, crossed the kitchen hallway, snatched up the yellow cleaning rag from the top of the basket because it still carried the warmth of her hands, gripping it like a trophy, and then a swinging service door opened at the exact moment he reached it, like a trophy. And then a swinging service door opened at the exact moment he reached it. And so, before the eyes of the 12 most powerful men in the northern half of the city, a polished black monster of great dignity entered the dining room with a bright yellow rag held sideways in his mouth, his tail wagging at an unhurried pace like a late-arriving guest who was fully confident he had an invitation. The knives and forks fell silent. The 3 guests nearest the door pushed their chairs back by instinct. One hand beneath the table had already moved halfway toward the holster, and the right reputation of the Marchetti dog in their world was no joke. In those 2 frozen seconds, the swinging door burst open a second time, and a small girl with hastily tied hair rushed in with one rubber glove still half on, completely unaware of where she had just stormed into, only managing to hiss in the voice of a mother catching her child skipping school, "Teddy, drop that rag right now. I'm counting to 3. The infamous monster stopped short, flattened his ears. Before the eyes of 12 bosses and all their guards, he dragged himself a step-by-step back toward the girl, lay flat on the carpet, released the rag, and used one front paw to push it gently toward her like a child surrendering stolen evidence. The girl bent to pick it up while mumbling an apology to the whole room with a hurried nod, grabbed his collar, and dragged those 70 kilograms of remorse back through the swinging door as quickly as her canvas shoes allowed, never once seeing the man seated at the head of the table. The door closed. The dining room remained as silent as a tomb for one more second, and then a sound no one in that room had ever heard rang out. Rocco Marchetti laughed. He laughed aloud, truly laughed, had to set his wineglass down, and the 12 faces around the table shifted from stunned to a confusion, even deeper than when the dog hall had walked in. Because in the memory of everyone seated there, including those who had attended this dinner for more than a dozen years, the man at the head of the table had never laughed beyond the faintest curve of his mouth. Salbianca broke the moment with his own booming laughter, slapped his hand on the table, and said, "See, didn't I tell you the boy needed a dog?" The whole table laughed after him, the air breaking open in a way as pleasant as a cork pulled from a bottle, and the dinner continued in a mood far softer than in any previous year. Only Gideon, from the corner of the room, saw what the laughter concealed, that at the far end of the table, there was one pair of eyes that hadn't laughed with everyone else, a pair of eyes that followed the swinging door for a few more seconds after it closed, then turned back and studied the host very slowly, very carefully, the way an old card player watches the greatest opponent at the table accidentally reveal the cards in his hand. And that night, as the black cars left the gate one after another, in the back seat of one of those cars, someone took out a phone, dialed a number saved under no name, and said briefly into the receiver to send word to the south side. Marchetti has a weakness, and it wears a maid's uniform. The first cold train report down over Chicago on Sunday night, and on Monday morning Josie arrived at the mansion with both cheeks unusually red, and a dull ache behind her eyes that she stubbornly just a little cold. Hourly workers did not have the concept of sick leave. Taking one day off meant losing one day's wages, and losing one day's wages meant being a week late on rent. She had known that calculation by heart since she was 23, so she swallowed 2 fever-reducing pills she had bought at a gas station, tied her hair tighter than usual, and began her shift like any other day. Teddy knew before everyone else did. The dog didn't leave her side from the moment she stepped through the side door. He didn't drag over a broom, didn't demand to play, only walked close beside her with his ears raised, now and then letting out a faint whine deep in his throat. But by mid-morning, when Josie was carrying a stack of bedsheets from the laundry room down the surface hallway, He began blocking her path, again and again, as if trying to make her stop. She pushed him away for the third time and told him not to be naughty, that she was too tired today to play, and that was the last sentence she managed to say, because the hallway in front of her suddenly tilted like the deck of a ship caught in a wave. The stack of white sheets slipped from her arms, and Josie collapsed onto the stone floor with them, neat and soundless. Teddy's howl tore through the mansion's quiet morning, a sound no one here had ever heard from this dog before, long, wild, echoing through the corridors like an alarm siren, and he stood there howling beside the unconscious girl until footsteps came rushing from 3 directions. Mrs. Pearl arrived first, then Danny Rourke, and the third person to reach them was the one who, according to every order of this house, should have arrived last, Rocco Marchetti, running, truly running, across the service wing where he had almost never set a foot, pushing aside the guard who had knelt down to lift her, and sliding his own arms beneath the girl's shoulders and knees, raising her from the cold stone floor himself. Mrs. Pearl later told the kitchen staff that she had served the Marchetti house for 26 years, and had seen that man sign papers that decided the fate of an entire neighborhood without the slightest change in his face. And yet that morning, when he carried the small maid down the hallway toward the nearest parlor, she saw his hands shake. He laid her down on the long sofa, ordered them to call the private doctor with 3 words, and while the entire room stirred in anxious confusion around them, a small object slipped from the pocket of Josie's uniform jacket and fell soundlessly onto the carpet, a notebook with a cardboard cover, its corners worn soft, swollen from dampness and from being opened too many times. Rocco bent to pick it up, intending to place it beside her again, and the notebook, in the way of things worn thin by use, opened on its own to the page most familiar to it. He didn't mean to read, but his eyes had already seen, and once they had seen, he could no longer stop. Page after page, filled densely with only one kind of writing, numbers. First round of ferry bills, crossed out. Hospital bed fee for March, crossed out. Payment plan for the breathing machine, $50, crossed out. Another payment, $100, crossed out. 3 years had been compressed into a few dozen yellowed pages. Every crossed out line a month of going without, an object sold, an extra shift piled onto an already existing one. The handwriting at the beginning of the notebook was still round and careful, but farther in, it flattened, hurried, grew tired, just like the person who had written it. And then came the last page with words on it. The handwriting on that page was not Josie's. It trembled, leaned unevenly, letters written by a hand that could no longer hold the pen straight but was still trying to finish. Don't sell your future to pay for your mother's past. Finish school, Josie. Beneath it, there was no signature, only a crooked heart drawn with ink that had run dry halfway through. Rocco Marchetti stood in the middle of that unsettled room, Mrs. Pearl's voice calling the doctor, Danny's movements as he arranged pillows, the dog's low whine beside the sofa, all of it receding from him like water pulling away from shore. He stood there, motionless, the notebook open in his hand, reading that final page once, then once again. A man who read financial reports every day that were 100 times bigger than this notebook, and not one of them had ever made him read a second time. Then he closed the notebook, carefully, as if closing something that might break, placed it back into the pocket of the girl's jacket, while she lay unconscious on the sofa, pulled the thin blankets Mrs. Pearl had just brought up to her shoulders, and did something that made Danny Rourke pretend to be busy tying his shoe. He pulled a single armchair beside the long sofa, sat down, and stayed there. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, diagnosed a viral fever combined with exhaustion, gave her 1 bottle of fluids, ordered absolute rest for 2 days, and throughout all of it, the man in the armchair did not say a single word except for one question, whether she was in pain. In the afternoon, when Josie woke in a parlor 10 times more luxurious than her rented room, panicked and sat up asking what time it was. Her afternoon shift at the diner, the person seated beside her was no longer the boss of the North Side, but had already returned to being the head of security, with his sleeves half rolled. He told her in an even voice that the diner had been informed she was taking the day off, that her wages for today at the mansion would be paid in full, according to the service company's policy, that she could check her contract if she didn't believe it, and of course that policy had not existed until noon, when someone had made exactly 1 phone call to the service company. Josie lay back down, embarrassed, murmured her thanks, her hand instinctively reaching toward the jacket draped beside the sofa. Only when her fingers touched the familiar bulge of the notebook, still in its usual place, did she truly breathe out, close her eyes, and go back to sleep, never knowing that the man sitting an arm's length away had memorized its final page, and that night, for the first time in 4 years, the boss of the North Side canceled his entire evening schedule without giving any reason at all, then sat alone in his study with a glass of wine not poured from any precious bottle, looking out at the dark backyard, where an overturned tin basin sat beside the faucet, and a dog slept on guard beneath the parlor window, in the closest place to the girl that he was allowed to lie. 3 days after Josie's fever broke and she returned to work, a stubborn rain moved in and covered Chicago from early morning, and the first person to see him since he was standing outside the gate was Danny Rourke during the noon watch. He reported over the radio that there was a woman around 30 standing across the street from the main gate. No umbrella, no raincoat, just standing there looking in, and Gideon answered briefly that they should keep watching and do nothing yet. The woman stood like that for 3 hours. Rain poured from her hair down to her shoulders, down to the shoes that had been soaked through since the first hour. Several times she stepped off the curb toward the gate bell post, and several times she retreated to the opposite sidewalk, as if between her and that bell button there was a wall only she could see, until finally Gideon himself had to go out, stand inside the iron bars, and ask what she needed. The woman lifted her face, and Gideon recognized her immediately, because he himself had escorted her out of these gates 11 months earlier. Ruth Calloway, former maid of the service wing, Josie's predecessor. "I need to see him," Ruth said, her teeth knocking together from the cold. "I know I have no right, but I don't have any other door left." By the customs of this house, the story should have ended there, but Gideon looked at the woman who had stood 3 hours in the rain without daring to press one bell, then turned back inside and made a phone call. 10 minutes later, Ruth Calloway was led through the side door, dripping water along the service hallway, into the small room beside the kitchen where the master of the mansion was already standing and waiting, without offering her a seat. Josie at that moment was folding towels in the laundry room some distance down the hall. She didn't mean to listen, but the door of the small room was not fully closed, and the strange woman's voice drifted out, trembling, broken, telling a story that made Josie stand more still the longer she heard it. Ruth's younger brother owed $18,000 to a casino on the south side, a casino belonging to Delano's people. The boy was 24 years old. They had come to his workplace twice, and Ruth had sold everything she could sell, borrowed from every place she could borrow, and now the only way left was to come here, to the place she knew she was not allowed to return to, because in this entire city there was only one man whose name carried enough weight to make the South Side release a debtor. The man's voice sounded after that, not loud, but every word came clearly through the crack of the door, asking whether she remembered why she had been made to leave this place. A long silence followed. Then Ruth answered, and answered everything, in the voice of someone who had nothing left to protect, saying that she remembered that last year Delano's men had found her at the bus station, knew her brother's name, knew about the debt, which at that time had only been $6,000, and offered to erase part of it if she recorded the times when cons would come in and out of the mansion, that she had done it for 7 weeks, until Mr. Ashby discovered it, and that she still could not understand, even to this day, was why the master had only had someone escort her quietly out the gate with her full final month's wages, instead of giving her the ending anyone in this line of work knew she deserved. In the laundry room, Josie set down the towel she had been folding. Her heart beat slow and heavy. She understood what she was hearing. She understood how her predecessor had left, and a cold question crawled over the back of her neck. What kind of work this house really did that the South Side had to plant someone inside to count cars, and betrayal was forgiven with 1 month's pay. Beyond the crack in the door, the man's voice rose again, still no louder than before, saying, "I spared you last year because you told the truth on the first question, and because they had their hand around your brother. That is how Delano has always worked. He doesn't buy people. He buys the weakest place inside them." A choked sob followed. Then came the sound of paper, the sound of a pen, and his voice sealed each word, slow and clear, like a stamp coming down, saying that as of this afternoon, Her brother's $18,000 debt no longer belonged to the South Side. He had already had his people buy it, and she should listen carefully. The debt of someone who had once belonged to him was his to collect, not Delano's. The boy would repay him through clean work at the lumber yard by the port. Once the $18,000 was paid, it would be finished. No interest, no extensions. If he was 1 week late, he would change his mind. "And you," he continued, and the temperature in his voice dropped so sharply that even Josie in the hallway felt it. "You receive exactly what you already knew from last year. This gate is closed to you forever. Today is the first and last exception. Go, and don't let me hear your name again." Footsteps, the sound of the door, then Ruth Calloway passed by the laundry room doorway, soaked through, both hands holding a sheet of paper to her chest as if she were holding a child. Her face drenched so completely that rain and tears could no longer be told apart, and for 1 second her eyes met Josie's through the crack in the door. The woman paused for half a step, looked at the uniform Josie was wearing, the uniform that had once been hers, and said only one sentence softly before continuing on. "People here don't forgive, girl. They only reprice the debt, never owe them anything." Josie stood among the stacks of white towels, listening to the footsteps fading toward the side door, and for the first time since the day she had walked through the black iron gate, she realized her hands had gone cold. That evening, she told Teddy about it while brushing his fur, her voice quieter than usual, saying, "I still don't understand what this place is, but I'm starting to think your head of security has a job much bigger than his title." And the dog, as always, kept that seat to himself. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, beginning with a strange behavior from Teddy that Josie would only understand much later. She was hanging the last batch of towels in the courtyard beside the laundry room, the area near the mansion's western fence, when the dog that had been lying obediently at her feet suddenly sprang up, his whole body going rigid, and charged toward the fence with a chain of sounds she had never heard from him before. It wasn't the happy bark he used when he saw the calico cat. It wasn't the coaxing whine he made when he wanted to play. It was a low, long growl rising from deep inside his chest, the kind of sound that reminded the whole world that beneath the name Teddy, there were still 70 kilograms of Neapolitan Mastiff. On the other side of the fence, on the public sidewalk, a man in a brown coat was walking slowly along the street, a phone pressed to his ear, with the appearance of an ordinary person taking a stroll. And yet the dog followed him from one end of the fence to the other, growling without pause, the fur along his spine raised in a ridge. Josie had to run after him and grab his collar, calming him every way she could, and when the man in the brown coat disappeared around the corner, Teddy still stood there staring after him for a long while, his nose lifted as he scented the wind. "What's wrong with you?" she asked. He was just walking by, and Teddy turned back to look at her with amber eyes, holding something he had no way to say. At 7 o'clock that evening, Josie was sitting in the laundromat near her rented room, as she did every Thursday night, waiting for her clothes to turn inside machine number 6, her eyelids heavy after the dishwashing shift she had just finished, when a man walked in without carrying any laundry bag. He was wearing a brown coat. He bought a can of coffee from the vending machine, sat down on the plastic chair 2 seats away from her, and started a conversation in the pleasant voice of a skilled insurance salesman, saying that she did laundry at this time every night, didn't she? And that machine number 6 had a week's spin cycle, so next time she should use machine number 3. Josie answered politely and briefly, with the city manners of someone keeping her distance, until he said one sentence that made her spine straighten. "Miss Mercer, I have a job offer for you, one that pays much better than both places you're working now combined." He knew her name. He knew she worked 2 jobs. The man turned the can of coffee in his hand, still using that pleasant voice, laying each thing out one by one as if arranging merchandise on a counter, saying that his side was a competing consulting company, that all they needed was a little harmless information about the mansion she was cleaning. The Times cars left. The Times cars came in, which days had more guests, a few photographs of any schedules posted in the kitchen if she happened to pass by them. No stealing, nothing illegal, just observation, the same thing she did every day with her eyes, only now with a camera, and the payment would be $75,000, paid in 3 installments, with the first installment coming this very week. Josie sat still. $75,000, equal to 4 years of grinding herself down at both jobs without taking a single day off. It was the hospital debt wiped clean with one signature. It was freedom from the 9-square-meter rented room. It was the tuition for the unfinished semesters. It was new shoes. It was every door that had slammed shut in front of her for the past 3 years, suddenly opening a crack at the same time. The man's hand pushed a folded piece of paper across the seat toward her, with a phone number written on it. Josie looked at the paper. Inside machine number 6, her clothes continued to spin, and inside her head, everything spun too. The face of her landlady every time rent was collected, the numbers she added and added again on the last bus of the day, and then, without knowing when it had happened, her hand had risen to touch the pocket over the left side of her coat, where there was a familiar bulge she carried with her every day. Her hand rested there for a while. Then Josie stood, opened the door of the machine before the cycle had finished, pulled out the heap of clothes still heavy with water, and stuffed them into her cloth bag, then said exactly 2 sentences to the man in the brown coat, not loudly, not trembling, that he had chosen the wrong person, and that in this laundromat, machine number 3, was the one with the weak spin cycle, which proved he had never done laundry here before, just as he had never truly intended to pay her a decent cent. She carried the bag of wet clothes and walked back to her rented room under the cutting cold, her hands numb, and the next morning, the first thing she did after stepping through the side door of the mansion was go straight to Mrs. Pearl and tell her everything. From the man in the brown coat outside the fence to the can of coffee in the laundromat, not even hiding the number 75,000. And she ended with a sentence that made the housekeeper, with 26 years of experience, set down the entire tea tray, saying that she didn't know how large the master's business was for his competitors to play this dirty. But Mrs. Pearl should tell security to check the fence again, and ask the head of security to be careful for her, because once people had your schedule, they had you. Mrs. Pearl looked at the gurgle standing before her in an old uniform and patched canvas shoes, a girl who had just refused enough money to change an entire life, and was now worrying over someone else's safety, and all she could say was that she would report it right away, and that Josie had done the right thing. At 10 o'clock that night, in the study on the 2nd floor, Gideon presented the entire incident, along with photographs of the man in the brown coat taken from across the street by the person following Josie. After comparing them with the files, they confirmed he was an independent broker who still did jobs for the South Side. And by then, every piece on the table arranged itself into place. The gray car had not been parked there for 8 days to frighten her. It had been there to study her. Delano had not intended to kidnap or rope. The old man had made the move he knew best, buying the weakest place, and he had selected the new maid because of the very file that had been so clean it needed to be checked twice. A girl drowning in debt, with no relatives and no support, the kind of profile that, in the trade on both sides of the city, people called an open door. He calculated everything correctly, Gideon said, except one thing. Then he repeated word for word what Josie had told Mrs. Pearl that morning, including the part about asking a head of security to be careful for her. The room was silent for a very long time. Rocco Marchetti sat motionless behind his desk, and Gideon, who had stood beside his boss through every kind of good news and bad, could not read that face for the first time. There was no anger on it, no calculation, only something very much like the way people looked at a lamp still burning in a neighborhood that had lost power. The only outsider in this city still loyal to him turned out to be the only one who didn't know who he was well enough to fear him. And that loyalty could not be bought, could not be threatened. It was simply who she was. "Send twice as many men to the laundromat in her rooming house," he said at last, his voice low. "As for the man in the brown coat, leave him alone. Don't touch him. When Delano sees the bait didn't take, he'll have to show his own face, and I want to see him show it." Gideon nodded and left, and the most ruthless man in Chicago remained alone in his study until very late. Before him, a distant photograph of the girl carrying a bag of wet clothes through the cold, her head lowered, her shoulders drawn in, never knowing that half a city away, inside a 9-square-meter room, the girl in the photograph was hanging that soaked laundry on a wire stretched across the room, scolding herself as she worked, saying, "You idiot, Josie. That was $75,000. Not $75. How did you throw it away without even blinking?" Then she crawled under the blanket and slept a dreamless sleep, straight and deep, the kind of sleep no amount of money in the world could buy. The first 2 weeks of December passed so peacefully that later, whenever Josie remembered them, she always thought of them as the last smooth stretch of road before the bend none of them had seen coming. The first snow of the season fell thinly over the mansion, and she came up with the idea of teaching Teddy to fetch objects by their proper names, an exercise she still remembered from her second-year textbook. She arranged 3 things in the middle of the yard: the rubber ball, the left slipper that had sacrificed itself for science, and the plastic ladle, then called out the name of each item for him to bring back. The first 3 days were a complete disaster. She called ball, and he brought the slipper. She called slipper, and he'd drag back the overturned tin basin from the snow along with it. But by the 4th day, the Mastiff could fetch all 3 items without making a single mistake. And the first person to clap was not Josie, but the head of security who, at some point no one quite understood, had moved his seat entirely from the stone bench beneath the maple to the steps right beside the yard where the game was taking place. He was changing in a way only long-time observers like Mrs. Pearl could measure. The previous week, he had still smiled with only one corner of his mouth. This week, he laughed aloud when Teddy misunderstood the command and brought back the right canvas shoe Josie was still half wearing, making her fall sitting down into the snow. And one afternoon, Danny Rourke crossed the backyard and had to stop to rub his eyes, because the most frightening man on the north side was kneeling on one knee in the snow, holding the plastic ladle high in his hand, patiently teaching the dog the correct pronunciation of the word ladle under the instructions of a Maid standing beside him with her arms folded like a supervisor. Josie noticed the change too, in her own way. She noticed that she had begun saving the little scraps of her day to tell him, instead of telling only the dog. She noticed that he remembered even the details she had mentioned 3 weeks earlier. The shoe brand she planned to buy when she had enough spare money, the name of the kind diner owner on the west side. And she noticed that on afternoons when he was busy and didn't come out into the yard somehow became unpleasantly wide. She did not give that feeling a name. A person who worked 2 jobs a day was not in the habit of naming luxuries. The man, however, could name it, and that was exactly why he suffered more. 3 times during those 2 weeks, Rocco sat in his study after midnight with a white envelope on the desk. Inside it something he had prepared long ago. 3 times he slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat before going down to the backyard, and 3 times he came back up with the envelope still in the same place. The first time she was laughing too loudly with the dog, and he couldn't bear to cut into that laughter with something serious. The second time, she told him about the diner being so busy she had been given a $20 bonus, her eyes lighting up over $20, and he suddenly feared that the envelope in his pocket would change that look in her eyes. The third time, he had managed to begin half a sentence, saying that he had something he wanted to show her, when Teddy carried over and placed between them a snow mouse he had just made by rolling it with his muzzle, his whole body trembling with pride, and the moment slipped away. "Show me what?" Josie asked after she had finished laughing. "Nothing," he said. "Another time." And the hand inside his coat pocket smoothed the edge of the envelope flat again. Mrs. Pearl watched all of this from the kitchen window, with the worry of someone who had witnessed the way this house had lost things. But even she had to admit that it had been a very long time since the Marchetti mansion had heard laughter from both sides of the yard in the afternoon. During those same nights, 11 miles south of the mansion, on a dark and empty road along the river, a car sat motionless with its engine off, and the man in the back seat did not turn on the dome light while he listened to the phone. The voice on the other end was hoarse and slow, the voice of someone who had never needed to speak loudly in his life, asking what he planned to do now that the girl had not taken the bait, because his people said Marchetti had been getting careless with business lately. The man in the back seat was silent for a while, looking out at the black river, then answered in a voice that, if Rocco had heard it, he would have recognized at once as familiar laughter turned down into something altogether different, saying that he should not be impatient, that the bait failed because he had fished like a fish market salesman, and if that girl could not be bought with money, then they would stop trying to buy her and use another way, and that other way had to be left to him, someone inside the house, to open the door with his own hand. The voice on the other end asked what kind of opening. The man slowly turned the ring on his finger and said that he had held that boy in his arms when he was 3 years old, that he knew which doors Rocco locked and which doors he forgot to lock, and that all the other man had to do was have his people ready and wait for word from him, because when the door opened, they must not be slow. The call ended without a goodbye. The car started, glided smoothly away from the riverbank, and on the other side of the city, in the thinly snow-covered backyard of the mansion, the dog sleeping before the laundry room door suddenly lifted his head in the middle of the night and stared south for a long while before lying back down, unseen by anyone, known by no one, while the snow kept falling. The emergency alliance meeting was called on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, appearing on no one's schedule, and that was why the mansion fell into a state of serious understaffing. Guests arrived earlier than announced. The kitchen wing couldn't turn fast enough, and Mrs. Pearl had requested the day off the previous day because of a cold. A cold that, when everyone thought back on it later, no one could prove anything about, and no one could forget that Sal Bianchi himself was the one who arrived earliest that day, smiling as he went straight down to the kitchen to ask where the housekeeper was, as if the old man had already known the answer. Josie was sent up to help in the main hallway for the first time since the day she had started work, only to carry things from the kitchen to the door of the meeting room, absolutely not to go inside. That was the order Gideon repeated again and again, and she had followed it exactly all morning, until she was carrying the third tray of coffee down the hallway, and ran into the handsome silver-haired man standing right in front of the double wooden doors, the man whose face she remembered from that dinner party, the one who had laughed the loudest when Teddy carried the cleaning rag into the dining room. He recognized her at once. "Ah, the dog's girl," he said with a smile as warm as a grandfather's, then glanced at the watch on his wrist, clicked his tongue, and said what a shame it was. The server inside had just had to run out to take an urgent phone call, while the room was waiting for coffee, so why didn't she bring it in for him? Just set it on the long table. Mrs. Pearl was sick, so everything was short-staffed today, and he said all of that while his hand had already settled familiarly on the door, pushing it open for her, as naturally as someone inside the house opening a door for someone else inside the house. Josie hesitated for exactly 1 second, Gideon's order echoing in her head, but in front of her was a respected older guest holding the door and waiting. Behind her was an entire morning where everyone had been rushing, and she was a worker used to handling things herself so she wouldn't trouble anyone, so she stepped inside. The room was longer than she had imagined, the ceiling high, a wooden table running the full length of the center, and around that table sat more than 24 men in dark suits, the air thick with cigar smoke and conversations cut off halfway when the door opened. Josie lowered her head out of courtesy, her eyes searching for an empty spot on the long table where she could set down the tray, and in the moment she lifted her gaze to find a path between the chairs, the entire room stood up at once. More than 24 men whose names were each enough to make a police station open a file, rose in the same beat, chairs scraping over the wooden floor, and all of them turned towards the second door at the far end of the room that had just opened, where a tall man in a black suit stepped in with a folder of documents in his hand, and they greeted him almost as 2 words dropping into the room as clearly as a hammer blow. "Mr. Marchetti." Josie followed the direction of those lowered heads, and her world stopped. The man at the far end of the room was her head of security, the man who had held the ladder steady for 15 minutes without a word of complaint, the man she had scolded in the yard over the sausage, and who had only said there wouldn't be a next time, the man who had knelt in the snow the week before to teach the dog to fetch the plastic ladle. That man was standing in the position where more than 24 bosses had to rise and greet him, in the room where police would have to knock and ask permission, under the name she had heard for 3 months from Mrs. Pearl's mouth, from the service company paperwork, from the small bronze plaque mounted outside the iron gate she passed through every morning. Marchetti, the name she had always thought belonged to some mysterious businessman on an upper floor who had never once appeared. The tray tilted in her hands, which had gone numb. 3 cups of coffee slowly slid, then fell, the sound of breaking porcelain on the wooden floor terribly loud in the room that had gone silent as an ice cellar, white fragments scattering around her patched canvas shoes, hot coffee spreading into a dark puddle beneath her feet, and Josie did not bend to pick it up. She only stood there, amid more than 24 gazes fixed on her, and looked straight at the man at the far end of the room. Their eyes met across the full length of the dead silent room, and in the girl's eyes at that moment there was none of what the men around the table were used to seeing. No fear, no cringing, not even tears, only one single question bare, piercing through the cigar smoke and the black suits, straight to the man standing at the end of the room. What had all of the past 3 months been? Rocco Marchetti, who had never been more than 1 second late to respond to any situation, stood motionless with the folder in his hand, his lips parting, and no sound came out. That very moment told Josie everything she needed to know, more clearly than any confession. She bent down, picked up each shard of broken porcelain with her bare hands, and placed it on the tray, the motions slow and straight, the movements of a professional worker until the very last second, then stood, bowed her head, apologized to the whole room for the accident, her voice not breaking on a single word, and turned to leave, passing Salbianchi, who was still standing beside the door. She did not see, could not see, that in the 10th of a second as she brushed past him, the corner of that respectable silver-haired man's mouth curved faintly, satisfied and discreet, like a craftsman hearing the first gear in his machine lock into its proper rhythm. The double wooden doors closed behind her. In the meeting room, 24 men slowly sat back down in strained silence. Someone called for a person to come clean up, and the meeting began 7 minutes late. 7 minutes during which the man seated at the head of the table did not hear a single word of the opening report, because outside, along the main hallway, a maid was walking faster and faster, through the kitchen wing, through the laundry room, out the backyard, where the dog was waiting for her as he did every day with the rubber ball already held in his mouth. And only when she dropped down in front of him, both hands embracing that large wrinkled head, did Josie allow her voice to tremble. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you? Everyone in this house knew. I was a fool." The meeting ended at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and Rocco came down to the backyard at 2 minutes past 4. But the backyard held only the dog sitting before the laundry room door, with the rubber ball long since fallen to the ground. Mrs. Pearl, summoned urgently from her own home, despite her cold, met him in the service hallway with the face of someone carrying bad news, saying that the girl had finished the rest of her afternoon work, folded every last towel neatly, dried the incidents and turned it back in its usual place, then asked permission to leave 20 minutes early, and left this behind. On the small wooden table in the kitchen wing lay a handwritten resignation note, the letters round and careful like the first page of some notebook, requesting termination of her contract according to the proper notice clause. Not one line of blame, not one word about what had happened that morning. So polite it was cruel, and beside the paper lay the keys to the service wing, placed back in perfect order. At 9 o'clock that night, the black car stopped before the rooming house on the west side of the city, and for the first time in 4 years, the boss of the north side went alone. No Gideon, no escort car, standing under the drifting sleet and knocking on the door of a nice rented room. Josie opened the door, saw him, and did not invite him in. She stood blocking the doorway. Behind her the room with clotheslines strung across it, and an old suitcase lying open on the bed. She spoke with her voice even and low, saying that the boss did not need to come in person, that her resignation had been written according to the rules, that the service company would send a replacement within the week, and that if he had come because he was afraid she would go his road around telling people what had happened in the meeting room, he could rest easy, because no one would believe someone like her, and she had no need to be believed. She pronounced every word of the boss roundly and clearly, as if setting stones down one by one between them. Rocco stood beneath the sleet, and the man who had never had to say anything twice suddenly realized he did not know where to begin. So he began at the clumsiest place, saying that he had come to apologize. Josie let out a short laugh with nothing happy in it. "Apologize for what exactly?" she asked. "Because you're a boss, or because I'm the fool?" 3 months, she raised 3 fingers. "For 3 months I sent you to carry flower pots. I scolded you in the yard. I told you about patching my shoes, about my mother, about things I've never told another living person. I even told Mrs. Pearl to warn the head of security to be careful in case bad people tried to hurt him. God, I worried about you before I worried about myself. And that whole house, more than a dozen people, Stood there watching me play the fool every day for 3 months under your orders." She stopped and drew in a trembling breath. "I'm not angry because you're rich or because of whatever work you do you understand? I'm angry because everything I thought was real in that yard turned out to be a performance with a script, a director, and only one person who was not given any lines." The sleet fell thicker between them. Rocco did not defend himself, did not deny it. He stood there and took every word as if accepting something he owed. Then he said, slowly, in a voice no one in all of Chicago had ever heard, that she was right about everything, wrong in only one place. That performance did have a script, yes, but it lasted exactly 1 week. The first week, when he had ordered his name hidden because he wanted to observe the new person the way he observed every new person. The 3 months after that were not a performance. He looked straight into her eyes. The 3 months after that were my greed. "Do you know what this whole city sees when it looks at me?" he said. "They see something they fear or something they want to ask for. That is all. For 20 years, that is all. My father died in the street, and at his funeral I had to stand there counting who had come to test me, and who had come to bargain. Then one morning, a girl poured an entire bucket of water over the most dangerous dog on the north side. And instead of running, she sat down and apologized to him. A girl asked me to hold a ladder, scolded me over half a slice of sausage. The only person in my life who looked at me and saw nothing more than an idle man being ordered around by a dog." He paused for a beat, his voice dropping lower. "I knew every day of silence was another day of lying to you. I knew it. But I was a coward. I told myself one more day, just one more day of being an ordinary man in your eyes, and tomorrow I would tell you. And I lied to myself that way for 91 days. Silence stretched between them, with only the sound of sleet touching the tin roof of the rooming house. Josie stood in the doorway, and for one very brief moment, her shoulders lowered as if she were about to soften. But then she shook her head, slowly, decisively, her eyes wet while her voice remained straight. "I believe you're telling the truth," she said. "That's the worst part, you know, because if you had been acting, I would have lost only 3 months. But if you're telling the truth, then I lost more than that. I lost the only pleasant place in my life where I thought I was being seen exactly as I was, and it turns out that even there, I was the only one who wasn't allowed to know the truth." She took one step back inside, her hand resting on the edge of the door. "Go home, Mr. Marquis. The road back to the north side is far, and thank you for the dog. Because of him, I was very happy these past 3 months. That is the only real part I can take with me." The door closed, not slammed, only closed, softly and decisively, the way someone closes a book she has finished reading, and the sound of the lock turning from the inside came very quietly. Rocco Marchetti stood before the closed door for a long while, sleet whitening both shoulders of his coat. A man who could buy this entire row of buildings in one afternoon, who could make more than 24 bosses rise with the sound of a door opening, standing motionless before the pressed wood door of a cheap rooming house, and for the first time in his life, understanding something no one had ever taught men like him, that there were doors that could not be opened by anything he possessed. Money could not open them. Power could not open them. Even waiting could not open them, because the key was on the other side now, in the hand of someone who had just decided to stop trusting him. He turned down the stairs, walked through 3 dark floors, reached the car, and sat behind the wheel for a very long time without starting the engine. And on the 3rd floor, behind the locked door, Josie sat down on the edge of the bed beside the half-packed suitcase, picked up the maid's uniform she had folded neatly to return according to policy, and cried, quietly and for a very long time, the kind of crying done by someone used to being allowed to make noise in rooms with thin walls. The dog knew before anyone told him. The morning after Josie submitted her resignation, he went and sat in front of the laundry room door while it was still dark, in the same place as every day, the rubber ball already placed at his feet, and he sat there through the hour when she usually arrived, through the lunch break, through the hour when she usually left, refusing breakfast, refusing his evening meal, only standing up now and then to circle the overturned tin basin beside the faucet before returning to the same spot and sitting down again. The second day was the same. Mrs. Pearl brought his bowl all the way out to him, even changed it to the boiled chicken he liked best, but he only sniffed it once and turned his face away. And the housekeeper of 26 years, who had never cried in front of the staff, had to hurry back into the kitchen. Danny Rourke tried throwing the ball, The ball rolled across the yard and came to rest against the wall, lying there with no one to fetch it. By the afternoon of the second day, Gideon had an upper latch added to the kennel gate, because the night before, the dog had pried the lower latch loose and stood at the main gate until morning, and people began taking shifts, watching him the way one watched someone who was ill. On the third night, Chicago was struck by rain. Not the drifting sleet from the night his master had stood outside the rooming house, but real rain, a wrong season downpour that came crashing over the city as if poured from the sky, hammering against the kennel roof, and through that rain the entire mansion heard the sound of wood breaking. Danny ran out first, his flashlight cutting through the sheet of water, and he froze in the middle of the yard, the radio lifted to his mouth but his thumb forgetting to press the button. The kennel gate had burst open, the upper latch snapped in two, and in the middle of the mansion's front entrance, right before the black iron gate, the Neapolitan Mastiff was standing in the rain. The dog who had been so afraid of water that no one had been able to bathe him for 3 years. The dog who looked at puddles as if they were old enemies. He stood there beneath the pouring rain, his whole body soaked and heavy, all 4 legs trembling in waves, both ears flat and close, his enormous frame shrinking into a fear everyone in that mansion knew was real, and yet he did not step back. He stood facing the gate, toward the road that led down to the bus stop, the exact direction from which, every morning for the past 3 months, a small figure with a cloth bag had walked in, and he kept standing there, blocking the only path, as though if he stood long enough in the right place, that person would have to come back, because she had never once passed through the gate without stopping to scratch his ear. Danny called him. He did not turn his head. Danny took a leash and stepped closer, and the dog did not growl, did not resist, only braced all 4 paws against the water-covered stone with the full force of his 70 kilograms, and 3 grown men could not move him even 1 centimeter. They called Mrs. Pearl. She came out under an umbrella, crouched in front of him, and spoke to him as if speaking to a child. He listened to everything, his eyes gentle on her, and then he looked back toward the gate. At last, someone had to call upstairs. Rocco came down to the yard without an umbrella. He walked past Danny, past Mrs. Pearl, past the ragged pools of flashlight in the rain, and came to stand beside the dog. And there he saw what could not be seen from the window, that the dog was trembling so hard his teeth were clicking together, trembling less from cold than from the water pouring over him. The thing that had once been punishment in a past neither he nor Rocco had forgotten, and yet he still stood there, eyes fixed on the gate, rainwater running dragons through the folds of his face down onto the stone, making it impossible, on the face of a dog, to tell what was rain. Rocco stood beside him. He did not pull, did not coax, did not command. He only stood there in the rain, the shoulders of his dark shirt growing darker and then soaked through, both hands hanging at his sides, looking with him toward the closed gate. After a while, the giant drenched head leaned sideways and rested against his hip, heavy and cold, exactly the way it used to rest against someone else's shoulder beside the basin of water during noons that no longer existed. Rocco placed his hand between the dog's ears. The 2 of them stood like that for a very long time. Gideon came out from the house with a black umbrella and a coat over one arm, stopped behind his boss, and said softly that the rain wouldn't let up any time soon, sir, that he would have a temporary cover set up here, and that his boss should go inside, because standing there would not solve anything. Rocco did not turn around. His eyes remained on the black iron gate, where the raindrops kept striking without end, and he answered with exactly 1 sentence, his voice calm as if settling a non-negotiable clause. If he can wait, then I can wait. Gideon stood there for 3 more seconds, then quietly closed the umbrella, held it in his hand, stepped back under the porch, and signaled Danny to lower some of the flashlights. In the front yard of the largest mansion on the north side of Chicago, beneath the heaviest wrong-season downpour of that winter, they left a man and a dog standing side by side in the open rain, both soaked, both silent, both staring toward a closed gate, the 2 largest and most frightening beings in the city, waiting together for someone who had never promised she would return, and the rain kept falling, falling on, as if the night sky also needed to empty something it had been holding inside for far too long. The morning after the rainy night, Gideon Ashby sat before 3 screens in the operations room, with an uneasy feeling he could not name. the professional instinct of a man who had spent 8 years living by noticing the things that had shifted out of order. And he began doing what he always did whenever that feeling appeared, reviewing the entire system from the beginning. Josie had resigned, but the order protecting her had not yet been withdrawn by his boss, which meant the surveillance shifts along her routes still had to run in full. And when Gideon opened this week's duty roster and compared it with the original roster he had personally drawn up from the day the gray car appeared, the letters on the screen suddenly became very cold. The Friday afternoon shift that week, the window from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the evening, the stretch from the diner on the west side back to the rooming house had changed. The 2 men assigned to that shift had been ordered to pull back and reinforce a cargo escort at the port. The replacement was listed as a transfer from Team 2, but when Gideon called down to Team 2, the captain there confirmed that he had received no transfer order at all, and so, on paper, everything sealed, while on the ground, Josie's route on Friday afternoon would be completely empty for exactly 40 minutes, from 6:10, when she got off her dishwashing shift, until 6:50, when the patrol around the rooming house began. 40 minutes. Enough for a car to pull close. Enough for 3 men to finish the job and disappear before anyone had time to realize anything was wrong. Gideon sat, motionless, before the screen for another 10 seconds. Then he did the second thing, tracing where the shift adjustment order had come from, and the answer made the hand holding his mouse stop completely. The cargo escort order at the port was real, with a valid authorization signature, sent through the Alliance communications channel, meaning it had not come from inside the mansion. It had come from one of the families, and more important than anything, the protection roster for Josie was a top-level confidential document. In the entire mansion, exactly 3 people had ever seen it. Gideon was the one who created it, his boss was the one who approved it, and the third person, the only outsider his boss trusted enough to show it to in order to coordinate the Northwest transport route and avoid overlapping movements, was Sal Bianchi. Gideon did not allow himself to conclude. 8 years in the trade had taught him that reaching a conclusion 1 hour too early could cost a life. But those same 8 years had also taught him that being 1 hour too late carried the exact same price. So he picked up the phone and called the second floor, saying exactly 4 words: "There's a problem, need to meet," then printed the comparison sheet and went up the stairs at a speed Danny Rourke, who was standing guard in the hallway, would later say he had never seen in that man before. That same morning on the other side of the city, Josie was sitting on the floor of her rented room between 2 folded piles of clothing, 1 pile to take with her and 1 pile to send to the thrift shop, when her phone rang. Unknown number. On the other end was the pleasant voice of a young woman who introduced herself from the Human Resources office of the Hartwell restaurant chain on the east side, saying they had received Josie's application through the Job Placement Center, that there was a full-time prep cook position with good pay and insurance, and that they would like to invite her for an interview on Friday afternoon at 6:30 at the branch office. Josie was so happy she sprang to her feet. A full-time job with insurance was the kind of thing she had been sending applications for over 2 years without anyone calling back. But as she hurriedly wrote the address on the back of the electric bill, 3 small details rose in her mind, like 3 grains of sand. That she didn't remember submitting an application through any placement center recently, that the Hartwell chain was hiring a prep cook, but scheduling an interview at 6:30 on a Friday evening, the busiest kitchen hour of the week, and that the office address was in a warehouse district by the river, not on the east side. She knew because bus number 17 ran past it. She was about to ask again when the woman on the other end sweetly confirmed the appointment and hung up. Josie stood in the middle of the room, looking at the electric bill in her hand, and the rational part of her, the part that had kept her alive through 3 hard years, whispered that something was wrong. But the other part, the part that was unemployed with exactly $420 in her account, and a resignation letter submitted the week before, answered that poor people didn't have the right to be suspicious of a job with insurance. At worst, she would get there, see that something wasn't right, and turn around. In the middle of the city in the late afternoon, what could anyone do to her? She folded the electric bill and slipped it into her coat pocket beside the notebook, then returned to the half-folded pile of clothes. Friday afternoon arrived beneath a sky thick and gray with the breath of snow. At the mansion on the north side, the second-floor study had been lit since noon, with 3 people inside, and a duty roster spread across the desk. On the west side, Josie took off her apron at 6:05, said goodbye to the diner owner, stepped out onto the street where the lights were coming on, and turned toward the bus stop for number 17, instead of the familiar route home. And on a small street, 3 blocks from the diner, where the evening shadows had thickened between 2 rows of old warehouses, the gray car that had been parked motionless since noon suddenly turned on its headlights and started its engine. At 6:12 on Friday evening, in the second-floor study, the last pieces finally locked into place with a phone call. Gideon's man, posted at the diner on the west side, reported that the girl had left her shift on time, but had not turned toward the rooming house. She was heading toward the stop for bus number 17, the route that ran down to the warehouse district by the river, and Gideon needed only 4 seconds of searching to discover that the Hartwell restaurant chain had no office of any kind in that area. That name existed only in a bait call. The 40-minute gap was not meant to catch her on the way home. It was meant to lure her, by her own feet, into a dead street. Rocco was out of the room before Gideon finished the sentence, and people later said that he covered 3 flights of stairs in less time than the elevator, that he drove himself without waiting for the driver, and that when the iron gate opened, a 70-kilogram black shadow from the backyard shot through the gap in the gate before the nose of the car did, bolting straight into the dark road and forcing him to open the back door for it to leap inside, because the dog that had not eaten for 3 days seemed to understand, in a way no science could fully explain, that his person was in trouble. At that same moment, 11 miles to the southwest, Josie got off the bus at the last stop that still had light, checked the address on the electric bill, and stepped into the street between 2 rows of old warehouses, where only half the streetlights were still alive, and the sound of her own footsteps echoed back from both brick walls. She had gone 30 steps when she heard the engine behind her. The gray car slid into the street, slowly, its headlights stretching long across the wet pavement, and every instinct that had kept her alive through 3 years screamed the same word at once: run. Josie ran. The engine roared behind her, tires grinding, and a second car from the far end of the street flashed its lights and rushed forward to block the exit. She was trapped between 2 beams of light closing in like the jaws of a snare. She lunged toward the only alley on the left. The gray car swerved to cut off the corner, its front end surging toward the place she was running, and in the split second she would later remember only a sound, the shriek of brakes, the sound of herself screaming. A massive black shape flew out of the darkness. The impact was not meant for her. Teddy slammed his whole body into her, knocking her out of the path of the car's front end. Both her knees struck the sidewalk, and behind her came a deep, dull sound, the sound of metal hitting a living body, followed by the cry of a dog that no one who hears it once ever wants to hear again. Josie turned her head. The dog lay on his side in the middle of the road, right in front of the gray car that had jerked to a stop. He was trying to stand on 3 legs, his left front leg pulled up completely off the ground, his whole body shaking violently, so panicked that he was growling even at the glare of the headlights, and he was right between the 2 cars, between the doors that were opening and the dark figures stepping out. No calculation happened in Josie's mind then. There was no room for fear. She scrambled up and walked straight into the road, into the space between the 2 beams of headlights, toward the dog in pain. She lowered herself very low 2 steps away from him, level with his eyes, both hands opened slowly so he could see them, and spoke in that even, low voice that did not tremble by so much as a thread, the voice from the first noon beside the basin of water. "Teddy, look at me. I'm here. No one's going to hurt you anymore. Just look at me, good boy. Now we're going to move to the side, all right, 1 step at a time. I'm right beside you." And the animal panicked by pain. The animal 3 grown men could not hold. Heard that voice and stopped growling, letting her slide her shoulder under his chest, taking part of his weight, and the 2 living souls helped each other step by step out of the roadway, cruelly slowly, beneath the eyes of 4 figures who had just stepped down from the cars and were closing their circle around them. A man's voice came from near the gray car, saying that she was a good girl, and now she should just stand right there. Someone only wanted to talk to her. No one wanted a mess. Josie backed against the brick wall, one hand still gripping the collar of the trembling dog, her eyes searching for a gap between the figures and finding none. All four sides had closed, and at the exact second the human ring began to move closer, the whole street exploded in light. 3 black cars charged in from both ends of the street at once, braking hard and turning sideways to block the road, headlight cutting straight into the circle and making the 4 figures freeze and raise their hands to shield their eyes. The sound of dozens of car doors opening came all at once, and from the first car, a man stepped out, walking through that blinding brightness with steps that were neither fast nor slow, not looking once at any of the 4 men, going straight to the brick wall and stopping directly in front of Josie and the dog, turning his back to her, facing the circle, placing his whole body between her and the black object one of the 4 men was holding tight against his hip. The entire street stood still. His men had spread out behind the 4 strangers, outnumbering them 3 to 1, but he did not retreat behind that wall of men the way any wise boss would have done. He stayed exactly where he was, his broad back covering the girl and the dog behind him, and when he spoke, his voice was so calm it was more frightening than any shout. Go tell Delano that tonight he touched 2 things, and I'm collecting the price for both. The 4 figures looked at one another, looked at the number of men behind them, then slowly retreated to their cars. Doors shut. Engines started. The 2 cars withdrew from the street twice as fast as they had arrived, and only when the last red taillight had vanished did the man turn back, look at the girl kneeling with her arms around the dog beside the wall, and the whole calm shell cracked in exactly one question, his voice gone hoarse. Are you hurt? Josie lifted her face to look at him, her hair fallen loose, her knees torn, both hands still gripping the trembling animal, and she answered with the kind of answer that belonged to the person she was, the answer that made Gideon, who had just run up, stop where he stood. Fine, but his leg is broken. Please call the nearest veterinary hospital for me. Hurry, please. That night, while Josie's was still at the veterinary hospital on the other side of the city, a phone call was made from the North Side mansion, its message brief, that there was an urgent matter involving the Northwest transport route that needed to be discussed immediately that night, and Sal Bianchi arrived at 10:50. Still handsome, still wearing the warm grandfatherly smile, taking off his coat while calling loudly from the hallway that if his nephew was calling at this hour, it must be about that Delano bastard again, that he'd heard what happened that afternoon. Reckless men, pure chaos, let him see what he could do to help. The old man walked into the study and stopped. There were no transport documents in the room. Gideon was not standing watch in the corner as usual. There was only Rocco sitting silently behind the desk, and on the walnut desktop, directly in the center, turned the right way for the person entering to read, lay a single sheet of paper, the protection roster for the travel route of a Maid, with the Friday afternoon shift circled in red ink. No one said anything for a very long while. Sal looked at the paper, then at the man behind the desk, and what moved across the old man's face in those few seconds, Rocco would later tell only one person about, saying it was the first time in his life he had ever seen a human being remove a mask, not have it stripped away, but remove it himself, because Sal Bianchi was clever enough to understand that a paper placed on the desk in that way meant every door of denial had already been locked before he entered the room. The old man pulled out a chair and sat without waiting to be invited, poured himself a glass from the bottle of liquor on the table with a hand that did not tremble, and when he spoke, there was no laughter left in his voice, only the weariness of someone who had been acting for too long. Do you want to hear it from the beginning, or only the part you haven't guessed? Rocco did not answer, and Sal understood that silence. He took a swallow, then spoke slowly, without circling around it, saying that the Northwest route had been losing money for 3 years, that he owed the South Side more than anyone in the Alliance knew, that Delano had not asked for money, Delano had asked for a door, and that on the night of the autumn dinner, when the whole table had seen Rocco laugh because of a dog and a maid, Sal had known he had something with which to repay his debt. He went on, evenly, as if reading the minutes of his own betrayal, that the message sent to the South Side that night had been his, that the duty roster had been copied by him when he was shown it for route coordination, that the coffee tray incident had been the move he had calculated most carefully, not to hurt the girl, but to make her leave Rocco's protection on her own, because as long as she remained inside that mansion, no one could touch her, and he paused for a beat before saying the final sentence. "Nephew, I am old. I only meant to open the door. I didn't expect Delano to send a car straight at the girl. That was the part I didn't foresee. Believe it or not, that's up to you." Rocco listened to all of it without interrupting once, and when the old man had finished, he finally stood, walked around the desk, and came to stand before the man who had held him when he was 3, who had poured him for a glass of wine in his life as a boss, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the ending anyone in this world knew by heart. But Rocco only said, his voice low and flat, that Sal was right about one thing. As long as she was here, no one could touch her, and he had just taught him that the opposite was also true. As long as Rocco remained in this world, she would never have peace. He turned his back and walked toward the window, continuing without looking back, saying that Sal's assets inside the Alliance would be decided by the families at the next meeting, that his men would not be touched. His children and grandchildren would not be touched. But from this minute on, he no longer had a seat at any table north of the river, and the only thing allowing him to leave this room through the front door instead of the back one was that when Rocco was 26, there had been a man who stayed with him through an entire night. "Go, Uncle Sal, don't let me see your face again, and pray that Delano treats people who have lost their value more kindly than he treats everything else." Sal Bianchi stood, aged by 10 years, in one evening set his unfinished glass beside the duty roster, reached the door, then stopped without turning back and said his last sentence in a voice almost a whisper, that the little boy he had once held did not know how to forgive, and Rocco had learned that from that girl, so he should hold on to her. Then he left, and the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway was the last time this mansion ever heard Sal Bianchi. Gideon entered the room immediately afterward, waiting for orders on the remaining matter, the south side, and he had already prepared 3 options in his mind, all of which ended in fire. But his boss was opening the wall safe, taking out an old thick brown envelope, sealed for a very long time, with a line of case numbers written in Rocco's own hand from 3 years or a year earlier on the upper right corner, and the order he gave did not belong to any of Gideon's options, that tomorrow morning, this was to be delivered to Whitfield's law office through the old channel, absolutely anonymously, addressed to the federal task force, with not one north side fingerprint attached to it, and no one was to open it before it reached its destination. Gideon took the envelope, heavier than he had expected, and could not hold back the question he had not asked in 8 years. What was inside it that his boss had kept for 3 years without using? And why use it this way now, when the law of the jungle was faster than the law, and he knew that? Rocco stood by the window, looking down into the dark backyard, where the overturned tint basin was covered by a thin layer of snow, and answered with a sentence Gideon would need many days afterward to fully understand, saying that inside it was another man's 3-year debt, that he had kept it as insurance for himself, but tonight he was returning it to its rightful owner, and that he was using the law not because it was fast or slow, Gideon, but because someone once told him that what mattered was that now, water could also be a sunny noon, and he wanted to see whether his hands could still do anything clean. Gideon did not understand, but he nodded, and the next morning, an untraceable brown envelope began its journey across the city toward the federal building, carrying within it the thing that would bring Frank Delano's Southside empire down within one winter, though at that moment, aside from the sender, no one else in the world knew what was inside. The waiting room of the overnight veterinary hospital on the west side had only 2 rows of plastic chairs, a coffee vending machine with a broken light, and the smell of disinfectant, while behind the frosted glass door at the end of the hallway, surgery on a Neapolitan Mastiff with a broken front leg had stretched into its 3rd hour. Josie sat in the row of chairs nearest the door, both torn knees still unbandaged because she had waved everyone off and said to take care of the dog first, and sometime after midnight, the waiting room door opened. Rocco stepped in, alone, his coat folded over one arm. He had gone back to the mansion to handle something and had returned. He sat down in the chair 1 seat away from her, leaving an empty chair between them, and said nothing. They sat like that for a long time, 2 people with 1 empty chair between them, listening to the wall clock and the faint sound of machinery behind the glass door. Josie was the one who spoke first, her voice hoarse, her eyes still fixed on the blurred door, asking that when they shaved the fur from Teddy's leg for surgery, She had seen the old scars, so many of them, even on his chest, and for 3 months she hadn't dared to ask again. But tonight she thought he owed her that answer. Where had Teddy been before he came to him? Rocco was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, slowly, his eyes fixed on some point on the tile floor, saying that 3 years ago, his people had followed a gambling ring on the south side, and at the end of that trail was a warehouse by the river, where they forced dogs to do cruel things to one another in exchange for wagers. The ones that won were allowed to live and fight again. The ones that lost were punished, and in that place, punishment was water. He stopped for a beat, his clasped hands tightening. The night he arrived, Teddy was the loser of the final fight. He was carried out of that place when he had already stopped struggling. The doctor said that if they had been 10 minutes later, it would have been too late, and for the 6 months afterward, Teddy wouldn't let anyone touch him, didn't trust any hand, and whenever he heard water running, he would press himself into a corner and shake as if that night had never ended. Josie sat motionless, and he went on, his voice dropping even lower. People asked why he didn't send Teddy to a rescue facility with professionals. He hadn't answered anyone, but he was answering her tonight, that he kept Teddy because when he looked at him, he saw himself, a creature held down long enough that even breathing had to be learned all over again. He had lost his father in the street when he was 26 years old, and the world that accepted him that very night taught him the same lesson as that warehouse, that the loser was not allowed to exist. So he learned how to win, kept winning, won so much that he forgot he had once meant to live another way. She turned to look at him and asked the final question, so softly it was as if she were afraid of breaking something. That ring, that warehouse, whose was it? Rocco looked straight into her eyes and said only one word, Delano. The waiting room went still. Josie slowly understood the full meaning of that night, that the dog thrown in front of the South Side car had rushed out to shield her from the very people who had once pushed him down into water 3 years earlier. He had met again the very thing that had destroyed him. Headlights, engines, the dark figures of the same master. And this time he had not run away. He had charged into the middle of it. She covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking, and Rocco let her cry, not touching her, not offering words of comfort, because he understood that there were some cries a person had to be allowed to finish. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, Danny Rourke brought a cloth bag from the mansion containing the dog's things, as Mrs. Pearl had instructed, the blanket from his kennel so he would wake to a familiar smell, the plastic ladle he always carried in his mouth, and as Josie spread the blanket over the chair to warm it, a white envelope slipped from between the folds, unsealed, with only one word written on the outside, Josie. She looked at him, he looked at the envelope, and for the first time since she had known this man, he seemed awkward. He said that he had meant to give it to her 3 times, and had not once been brave enough, that on the night the dog went out and stood in the rain, he had tucked it into the dog's blanket, because he thought if he himself didn't dare give it to her, then he would let Teddy do it, since Teddy had never disappointed her. Josie opened the envelope with unsteady fingers. Inside there was no money, no love letter, only an admissions packet from the state veterinary school, a completion program for students who had interrupted their studies, each line already filled in with straight, rigid handwriting, Josie Mercer's full name, the number of credits she had accumulated, the expected semester of return, with only the signature box left blank, along with a small handwritten note that said, not a gift, an investment. My future rescue center needs a doctor. Salary negotiable. Working conditions include one very badly behaved dog. Josie read it, then read it again, and tears fell onto the paper. Not the quiet tears from earlier, but the kind that broke open, because she realized this man had heard her tell the story of leaving school beneath the maple that day, had remembered it, had found the right program, the right credits, and had wrapped all of it into a job offer instead of a gift, because he knew, he understood, that she was the kind of girl who would tear up a check but could not bear to refuse a job saving dogs. She sat there with the papers on her lap and blurted out something she had never told anyone since her mother's funeral, her voice breaking into pieces, saying, You know, for 3 years I cared for my mother, cared for other people's houses, even cared for the stray cat outside the fence. I'm used to being the one standing beside the sick bed of everything in this world. But tonight is the first time a living soul nearly died because of me, not because it needed me to care for it, and I don't know what to do with that." Rocco looked at her for a long while, then answered in a voice low and steady, saying that she didn't have to do anything at all. She only needed to still be here when he woke up, and the rest should be left to the two who owed her. Just then, the glass door at the end of the hallway opened, and the surgeon stepped out, removing his mask, tired but smiling, saying the surgery had gone well, the bone had set cleanly, that this dog had astonishing vitality, and now he was starting to wake and kept thrashing around as if demanding something. Did the family want to come in? Both of them stood at the same time, and in the white-lit recovery room, the Neapolitan Mastiff with one leg in a brace had barely opened his eyes before trying to lift his heavy head, not to look for food, not to whine from pain, but to press his nose into the hand of the girl lay bending over him. Then he let his head drop and fell asleep again, peaceful, as if all 70 kilograms of him had just confirmed the only thing in the world that mattered, that his person was still here. Dawn reached the recovery room through the narrow eastern window, a pale winter strip of sunlight slowly crawling across the white tile floor, and Josie Goyuk in the chair beside the large kennel with someone's draped over her shoulders, her neck aching, and the first thing she saw was the Neapolitan Mastiff, awake, alert, his front leg wrapped in a white brace and stretched neatly before him, watching her sleep with the expression of a guard rather than a patient. He ate half a bowl of recovery porridge, the doctor on duty said, a record for a dog fresh out of surgery, and when Josie slipped her hand through the bars of the kennel to scratch the exact place behind his ear, his tail, as thick as her wrist, thumped against the bedding in 3 slow beats, enough to make her turn her face away to hide her red eyes for the second time in only a few hours. Rocco was not there. He had left near dawn when Gideon came to report something that could not be postponed, and he returned at 9 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee bought from the corner shop, cheap paper cup coffee that he likely had not held in his hands for 20 years. He handed 1 cup to her, and Josie accepted it. That was their first communication of that morning. They stood beside the dogs and kennel for a while, and then Josie said, without circling around it, that she had been thinking since daylight came, and she had something she wanted to say, but she wanted to say it in front of Mr. Ashby, because this needed a witness. Gideon was called in from outside the car and stood at the end of the room with his usual unreadable face, while the girl in dust-stained clothes from the night before, her knees wrapped in white bandages, stood straight-backed in the middle of the recovery room, and spoke to the most powerful man on the north side of Chicago in the even. Clear voice of someone who had weighed every word through a sleepless night. She said that she would sign the admissions papers, but she wanted 3 things made clear first. First, she was not coming back to the boss Marchetti. She was coming back to the man who had stood in the rain with a dog, man who had held a ladder steady for 15 minutes, the man who had admitted fault over the sausage. If that man had only been a role, played for 3 months, he should tell her right now, and she would finish her cup of coffee and leave, without resentment. Second, the rescue centers mentioned in that note had to be real licenses, real doctors, saving real animals. She had heard enough over the past 3 months to understand that people could use a beautiful name to cover all kinds of things. If it was built to launder anything from that other world, she would be the first person to call the authorities. He heard her clearly, and Mr. Ashby was there as a witness. And third, she paused for a beat, her grip tightening around the coffee cup. Third was the hardest thing to say. She was not asking him to become someone else overnight. She was not that naive. But she needed to know whether the road he was walking led out or led deeper in, because she had stood beside one sickbed for 3 years, and she knew she could endure hardship, could endure poverty, but she could not endure sitting in another waiting room to hear news about someone she did not want to lose. The room stayed silent for a long time after that last sentence. Gideon looked down at the toes of his shoes. The dog in the kennel looked from one person to the other, and Rocco Marchetti, the man more than 20 bosses had to rise to greet, set his paper coffee cup on top of the medicine cabinet, then answered each condition one by one, slowly and firmly, like signing each page of an agreement. The first thing he said was that the only role he had played over the past 3 months was the title of head of security. As for the man who held the ladder and got scolded in the yard, that was the truest part of him in 20 years. She could keep that part. It belonged to her. The second thing, the license would be in her name. The books would be in her hands. There would be an independent audit every year. And if even one unclean dollar passed through that place, she would not need to call the authorities. He would close it himself before she did. He stopped before the third thing for the longest time, and when he spoke, he did not look at her but at the dog lying between them, saying that last night, before he returned here, he had begun something he had delayed for 4 years. He would not tell her the details, because there were doors that had to be closed slowly, or they would slam down on other people's feet. The families needed time. The business routes had to be moved piece by piece into clean work. He would not promise her a day. He would promise her a direction, and the man standing at the end of the room would be the one to tell her if he strayed from it. Gideon, from today on, that is your highest duty, higher than protecting me. Gideon lifted his head, looked at his boss, then looked at the girl and gave one short nod, but everyone in the room understood that the nod carried the weight of a notarized commitment. Josie stood still for a long while. Then she stepped to the side of the kennel, set down her coffee cup, and straightened the bedding that had bunched beneath the dog's body. When Rocco's hand also reached down to smooth the other edge of the blanket, she did not pull her hand away. She placed her hand over the back of his, on the blanket still warm from the body of the animal that had nearly died because of both of them. No one said another word. No more words were needed. There was only the winter sunlight crawling a little farther across the white tile floor, the dog breathing steadily between the two hands resting one over the other, and Gideon Ashby, who in 8 years had never left his post without an order, quietly opened the door and stepped into the hallway, closing it very softly behind him. Then he stood guard there, as if guarding something he had just understood was more precious than anything he had ever been assigned to protect. 1 year later, on a sunny December morning, on a wide piece of land on the north side of the city that had once been an old warehouse, people hung a new hand-carved sign over the wooden gate with a simple line of words, Teddy's Yard, a rescue and rehabilitation center for wounded dogs, and the person cutting the opening ribbon was not the investor standing behind it, but a 28-year-old girl in a white lab coat that still smelled of new fabric, her hand trembling so badly that she missed the first cut with the scissors, and the whole yard burst into applause and laughter instead of reproach. Inside the main building, in the where Josie would teach volunteers every weekend, a small glass frame hung with quiet honor in the center of a white wall. Inside it was a yellowed page with the trembling, slanted handwriting of a mother, and every time Josie stood to teach, she needed only to lift her eyes to see it, as if somewhere, someone was nodding with satisfaction because her daughter had finally finished her schooling. Out on the large grass yard, opening day was lively like a small neighborhood fair. Children from nearby homes were led in by their parents to play with the dogs that had recovered and been trained to be gentle. Children's laughter ringing all across the sunlit yard. A red-haired boy threw a ball for a spotted dog, and the dog took a running start and slid long across the grass, making all the little ones collapse with laughter. Teddy, with his leg fully healed and only a faint scar left as a keepsake, moved with dignity among the children, like a chairman inspecting his grounds, having Pete squeezing every side and collecting so many treats that Mrs. Pearl had to come out and confiscate some of them for fear he would gain weight. Danny Rourke now wore the uniform of the Spencer's security team instead of the mansion's, while Gideon Ashby attended as the legal representative of the Funding Foundation, a foundation whose first independent audit report was so clean that Josie herself had to read it twice, just as a promise had once been made in a recovery room on a winter morning the year before. And during that same year, readers of the city papers would surely still remember the federal case that brought down the entire South Side underground system, a case that began with an anonymous file that, to this day, no one knew who had sent. In the middle of the morning, while the opening celebration was still crowded, the center's rescue van returned from its first trip, bringing with it a shepherd mix that had just been rescued from a neglectful owner, starved down to skin and bone, and the moment a volunteer led it past the outdoor bathing station, the animal froze, braced all 4 paws, and began trembling as it stared at the streak of water spreading across the cement, with the exact look Josie had seen once in her life and would never forget. She motioned for everyone to step back and turn off the faucet, then crouched down on the damp cement, lowering herself to the strange dog's eye level, rolling up at the sleeves of her lab coat, dipping both her hands into the basin first so it could see, and beginning to speak in that slow, steady, patient voice. And by the window of the main building, a tall man stood looking down, a cup of coffee in his hand, motionless, just as he had on an autumn morning a year before, only this time, when the girl in the yard looked up and caught his eyes, she smiled, and he smiled back, with no curtain and no secrets left between them. Their story, if it had to be gathered into a few words, would perhaps be this. You don't heal a wound by dragging it into water. You sit down patiently and let it trust itself enough to step closer. That is true for a dog, and it is true for a human being, because sincere respect does not distinguish whether the one across from you is a boss or a maid. It distinguishes only who is patient enough to see another soul. And sometimes, the greatest power in this world does not lie in making others bow their heads, but in helping a trembling living being dare to trust one more time. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. And what about you? How do you feel about the journey of Josie, Rocco, and Teddy? Which moment in the story moved you the most? Please write it in the comments, because we truly want to listen to feelings from deep within your hearts. Every line you share gives us the strength to keep telling kind stories every day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moments of this video. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and days